Good afternoon or early evening. Thank you for joining us. We're gonna get everybody in the door, the virtual door, and then we'll start. Okay, well, let's start. My name is Cheryl Court, and I'm with the Coalition for Smarter Growth. We're a nonprofit working in the DC region, and have been collaborating a lot with Ward 3 Vision, which is co-hosting this meeting with us. And we want to do a series of educational forums because we're excited about the comprehensive plan in DC being completely redone, and they've just kicked it off, and so we're excited to participate in that, and we want to give people lots of ideas and tools to work with on how we can make the most out of this opportunity and look at cutting edge tools in planning and zoning and how that could benefit DC. So we have invited some leaders in the field who will introduce themselves in a minute. And we're excited to learn about the what they're calling better zoning, and in our field is sometimes called form-based codes or form-based zoning. And so we're going to invite them to explain that. And I'm going to turn it over now to Ellen McCarthy, if she's sitting in her seat, to moderate this this forum and lead us through the evening. And so we will start with hearing from Colin and Rene. And then after that, we'll try to leave plenty of time for questions. So that'll be the end of the time. So our presentation discussion will be about 45 minutes to an hour. And then we'll have time at the end for questions. And so with that, I want to turn over to you, Ellen, if you want to say anything else, and introduce our guest from Code Studio.
Well, we are so grateful and really thrilled that Colin and Rene can join us today, because Code Studio is widely regarded as the top firm in the country that has the special expertise in form-based codes. So I'll let you guys introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about your background if you want before you get into the nitty-gritty. But thanks again for giving us this time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we'll just jump right in, shall we? Hopefully everybody can see our screen. Is we good? There's nothing worse than getting halfway through a presentation and realize you're not sharing your screen properly. So just a little bit about myself, Colin Scarff, principal and co-founder of Code Studio, been doing this type of work for 25 plus years or so now. Sometimes I wonder if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it depends on what day of the week it is. But I've had the pleasure on working on, I would suggest, some of this country's biggest zoning code update projects. So Code Studio has been working in LA now for almost 10 years, trying to get some new zoning adopted there. We worked on Denver's zoning back in 2010, probably considered the first or second, maybe kind of citywide form-based code in the country. We've worked in Raleigh, currently working in Detroit, Cleveland, Houston, Memphis, Durham, Richmond, and St. Louis, just to name a few. And so I've got Rene Biberstein here with me tonight, who's going to help walk us through this presentation. So I'm just going to let Rene introduce himself real quick.
Sure. Thanks, Colin. So I'm Rene Biberstein, Associate Principal at Code Studio. I've been with the firm for not a long time, I guess it's 2022, but about 15 years of experience in doing project management and urban design work elsewhere. And so right now I'm managing Code Studio's work in Richmond, and have worked on Richmond, St. Louis code comprehensive code updates, and then just a couple of other much smaller zoning studies closer to you guys in Prince George's County and in Fredericksburg, Virginia.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Rene.
Colin.
Thanks, Rene. So I'm based in LA, over on the West Coast. Rene is based in just outside of Toronto in Canada. I'm originally from the UK, if maybe you can tell, maybe you can't anymore. But it is April 23rd, which is St. George's Day. So happy St. George's Day to everybody out there. For those of you don't know, it is, St. George is the patron saint of England. So it's like the equivalent of St. Patrick's Day, I guess, but not quite as widely celebrated. But
Isn't it also Shakespeare's birthday?
yeah, there you go. I don't know. Is it?
Indeed.
Okay. Thank you. So I've personally been doing this for a while. We founded Code Studio in 2006. We work on plans and codes that yield vibrant mixed-use walkable communities with a real focus on infill and redevelopment. So Code Studio's almost been around 20 years. So next year will be our 20th anniversary. We're kind of a small but mighty firm, I would say. So we've got about 13 employees. We do this work from 4 kind of locations across the country. Like I said, I'm based in LA. The head office for Code Studio and was founded in Austin, Texas. We have an office in Atlanta, and Rene is just outside of Toronto. So give or take, we've worked in about 33 states across the country. This is probably a little bit out of date. We're not necessarily keeping this up to date, but over the last 19 years, we've worked on about 110 projects, a lot of codes, a lot of form-based codes, a lot of zoning codes, and a lot of unified codes. Zoning codes is primarily the kind of work that we do. And so this is just kind of I won't go into all of these projects necessarily, but this is just kind of give you a snapshot of some of the places we've worked over the last 19 years or so on a variety of different types of code projects and plans. We do a little bit of planning. The planning work that we do is pretty much related to implementation and zoning. And so we work with communities across the US to kind of help bridge that gap between planning and zoning, in making sure that we're giving folks the kind of tools they need to kind of implement their plans. We really, focus on fostering infill, working on housing options. We feel like we craft innovative code approaches. We draft codes with predictable outcomes, and we really focus on kind of creating user-friendly, easy to administer codes. I think the one thing that we do a really good job of is how we display information. We work really hard in kind of the organization of our material, using tables and graphics and page layout to help make zoning as understandable and as accessible to as many different people as possible. So just a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to touch on a little bit about what is a form-based code in today's world? Why do cities need better zoning? What is the right approach to zoning? And then after we've heard all this, where do we go from here? Kind of what are the next steps? So what is a form-based code in today's world? So, really, what isn't a form-based code, right? So traditional Euclidean zoning focused on land use, the separation of land uses, with really no or minimal controls on what we might call form, really focused on separating uses from one another. Did that work? Has that worked? I guess that's a debatable conversation. I think, you kind of have these amorphous standards associated with kind of Euclidean zoning, FAR, units per acre as it pertains to residential density. Parking requirements aren't very scientific. They're all kind of intended to control kind of negative impacts. But, I think at times they've resulted in unintended and undesirable outcomes. So what is the future of zoning? I think, the separation of uses isn't working. Zoning hasn't focused enough on built outcomes. I think there's been a real push, maybe in the last 20 years or so, to kind of move away from Euclidean-based zoning and focus more on built outcomes. And so more and more communities, more and more cities are looking for a different approach to zoning, one that kind of regulates form and just trying to restore, getting back to traditional patterns of urbanism. So, is it form-based code or is it just better zoning? I think that's kind of the question that we've been asking ourselves over the years. Euclidean and form-based zoning are kind of part of a spectrum with a wide range of possibilities in between. We historically have kind of tried to stay away from the kind of the terminology of form-based code. It can be a little bit misleading, I think, and we think that there's a real possibility to integrate form in kind of to the existing approach to zoning, right? And so we've been calling it form-focused or form-forward, or simply better zoning. Looking at ways to do a better job of integrating approaches to form in kind of the citywide approach to zoning. And so just kind of quickly, what are the kind of the basic elements of form that we should be looking at and we should be regulating? So, historically, we've had things like minimum setbacks, right? Where buildings are set back from the street, right? So, one approach to form now is to have build-to lines to pull buildings up to the street, so that there's not parking between the building and the street. We are looking at things like height of buildings, so vertical massing, and we are looking at horizontal massing, right? Because those are things that we might care about. How tall are buildings? How wide are buildings? Do they feel human scaled? Are they pedestrian oriented? Are things that we now care about. So it's one thing to pull buildings up to the street, but what we've got to do when we're pulling buildings up to the street is we've got to make sure there's active facades up at the street, right? So we're regulating things like the minimum and maximum amount of transparency on building facades, making sure the floor heights are appropriate, making sure there's no large blank walls up at the street. And then most importantly, we're making sure there's building entrances up at the street. It's nothing worse than pulling buildings up to the street and then having no reason for anybody to be up at the street. So you've got to have those entrances and entrance spacing along the street front. And then making sure we've got open space, right? We've got to have outdoor areas for places for people to be, for people to congregate, to enjoy the outside air. And then this is kind of where the line gets blurred between zoning and form-based coding, is the public realm. Oftentimes we're looking just at zoning projects, which means we're really not looking on the public side of things. We are really focused on private property. And so trying to blur that line between the public and private, and at least making sure that you're getting appropriate streetscape requirements. So you're getting appropriate width sidewalks and appropriate width tree planting areas, and that you're getting trees between the buildings and the street to enhance that pedestrian environment. And so why do our cities need better zoning? So I'm going to pass it over to Rene, and he's going to talk to you a little bit about this question number 2.
Thanks, Colin. Next slide. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple of the big issues. These are not exhaustive, but just some of the main reasons why we need zoning and why zoning in some ways hasn't worked, and reasons why zoning could be better and how it could be better. So thinking about all those questions together. Issue number 1, this is the big one and sort of the most obvious one, urban quality of life. So I grabbed this image pretty much randomly from the internet. I actually don't even know where this is. Could be in many, many different cities across the country. Looking at images like this, the thing as a planner that always comes into my mind is that, this is post zoning. This is post the introduction of zoning. So somebody signed off on every one of these little projects, every one of those signs, every one of those drive-throughs, strip malls, whatever. Some of that went through the process of zoning, and somebody signed off. And so, how did that happen? How did we, through all this sort of regulation and so forth that we have, how did we produce outcomes that are this dissatisfactory? And so, thinking about some of that, so badly crafted zoning is some of the reasons behind this. It's produced in a lot of places a poor quality of life in cities and suburbs and towns. And what are some of the things about that are bad? We touched on a few of them already. Rigid separation of uses through Euclidean zoning is a traditional thing that's been criticized for a long time, but still happens in a lot of places. And then aside from that, poorly regulated form. So either form being regulated, not being regulated at all, or being regulated in ways that are negative in terms of the impact. Next slide. And a classic error that's made in zoning is that you get suburban zoning essentially imposed on urban areas. So in a lot of cities across the country, you have laws that favor suburban development over urban development. The reason for that is basically that when new suburbs were being built, new subdivisions, zoning was produced for those new places, and some of it got imposed back onto pre-zoning constructed areas or areas that were constructed very early in the history of zoning, and it was a mismatch. So on the left-hand side here, you see the traditional infill development pattern. Some of the features of that are shared access to things like open space, shared things like parking, and a mix of uses and building types generally sort of allowed together. And the result is a much tighter knit, more urban development. In the sort of more suburban approach, every single one of those things, every one of those little strip malls or whatever you see along the highway before is a sort of self-contained thing with its own parking, its own stormwater management, and then again, the sort of rigidly separated uses its own, and also its own access from the street, some curb cuts. So when you take the thing on the right and you try to impose it back on the left, it produces a really kind of a nasty mismatch. Next slide, please. And another image is just having that happen in form. Left-hand side, a traditional pre-World War II development pattern of a main street, the more suburban development pattern. And then if you try to impose that suburban style of zoning on the urban area, you start getting a kind of a weird mismatch of things where you're effectively kind of forcing new development. When something gets replaced, where there's infill, you're forcing it to follow the suburban approach. Next slide. And this is just an image that was taken from Atlanta, and pretty stark here, historic scene, huge amounts of density, all kinds of diversity of buildings. And then later on today, lots and lots of surface parking. You can see just a little bit of that original form there. So this is partly a product, not only this, of other economic factors for sure, but partly a product of imposing suburban zoning onto urban areas. Next slide. And so some of this results in a loss of housing diversity. So, new development is often out of character and reduces the diversity and affordability of housing stock. I'm going to talk more about affordability in a sec. Neighborhood serving businesses and buildings become quote unquote illegal or non-conforming under existing zoning. And a lot of parts of cities that we love effectively can't be rebuilt today. All this stuff is effectively non-conforming now. Next slide. And so the question is, okay, going back to zoning again, we've sort of seen how zoning has harmed areas. Can better zoning improve my neighborhood? I think the answer is yes, but it also, with some caveats, zoning can't force the market to build something it doesn't want to build. So it's not going to force people to build a certain thing, but a lot of development and a lot of what the market does follow a path of least resistance. So it's effectively kind of telling you, this is what we want as a base case. Yes, you can apply for variances. Yes, there are sort of ways out of certain things, but here is the path of least resistance. Here's what we want. And if you do that, you're going to get your building approved quickly and simply. And so that's sort of the path that we want to put things on. We want to sort of set up the default to be the best possible thing, rather than having the default being, the worst possible thing or some sort of a substandard thing. So that's the path we want to set cities on in zoning. Next slide. Second issue here, and this is, I've touched on this already, and it relates a bit to the last one, but the other big conversation, and I would say probably the biggest conversation in talk about planning and urban development is affordability. You've seen many headlines for years now about the housing crisis, lack of housing, cost of housing, especially difficult for young people to get into the housing market. Next slide. And there's certainly a lot more you could say about this, about the reasons for this, but in terms of some of the top ones, there's a mismatch that we know about between household size and the availability of housing stock. So 53% of American households today, at least at the time of this data, were single people and couples. Traditionally, household sizes, as we know, were much larger, but only 12.5% of housing stock were studios and one bedrooms. And next slide. And even if you add on 2 bedrooms, it's still only 39% of housing stock. So there's a mismatch between size of households and availability of housing that's resulting in a lot of housing becoming too expensive for small households to afford and sort of inappropriate in terms of their needs. Next slide. And there's an undersupply of housing that's across the country. So this is showing the undersupply of housing per state. It's been going up generally over time because there's a little bit of a drop from 2021 to 2022 in the last bit of data we have here is, but it's generally been going up over time. And you can see on the map that it's the most intense in some of the states that are the fastest growing, places like California and Texas. Next slide. And so what contributes to housing costs? What's actually causing housing to become more expensive? It's a variety of different factors. And again, I'm not an economist, so there's a lot more complexity here, but it's a combination of these things called the 5 Ls: laws, lending, land, lumber, and labor. Those combine to produce the cost of housing. Next slide. Some of these are influenced by the market, and some of these are influenced by legislation. So as thinking about local municipalities, what can you do? Some of the stuff, yes, at the macro level, at the federal government level, there's ways the government can affect the market and can stimulate development. But at the local level, you're really looking at things like zoning and other types of regulation. So next slide. So things like zoning and also things like building codes, other types of legislation that's passed at the local or the state level. This is sort of part of what we can do. And yes, one could say that developments can apply for variances and rezonings, all kinds of other things. But like I say, we're trying to set up a path of least resistance and a path of predictability. So we're going to start with the best possible thing, and that's what we're going to ask for. And we're going to make people ask for a change if they want to do something else. So it's trying to set up the best possible outcome from the beginning and really identify what the community wants, what's the best thing for each one of these sites, and rezone them. And it's also more efficient in terms of cost. So when you're working against this, you're effectively having to put more emphasis into subsidizing development. So if you can make the right type of development, that diversity of housing stock, that availability of density, that availability of smaller units, that are more appropriate for younger buyers or different types of households, that when you make that legal from the first point, when you allow that supply, the cost of housing goes down. The alternative is to try and pump money into subsidies, and sometimes we do need to do that. But when you're working against the prevailing laws, it becomes much more expensive. So better to kind of actually establish through laws what we want and allow that to actually happen, rather than trying to do these sort of subsidies that override the regulatory system. Next slide. So subsidy is needed to navigate regulations. Less money is required to deliver affordable units. Next slide. And so kind of some of the outcomes of these two different things here. So I talked about both quality of life and affordability. Here's the worst possible outcome that we don't want, but unfortunately we see all too often. So in terms of quality of life, suburban standards being applied to urban areas, effectively incentivizing auto-oriented infill development. Now you could say the market wanted to do that anyways, but we've made it easier for them. We've set the path of least resistance in that direction in a lot of cases. Existing buildings, historic buildings, are considered to be non-conforming, and that adds a lot of red tape around updates and modifications. So somebody has a nice old building, they want to make some modification to it, the building is non-conforming, it's an extra hoop they have to jump through to get approval to do that modification, even though it may be something that we want as a community. Separation of uses and poor interface with the public realm do things like discouraging walking and cycling. And again, it's that vicious circle about creating poor environments that incentivize car use, and then expectations around car use going back into zoning and effectively promoting this idea of imposing suburban zoning on urban areas. On the affordability side, the worst possible thing is, again, limitations on density combined with minimum lot size requirements force large, expensive units. So this is what is driving a fair amount of suburban growth, are these requirements. And again, you may say, well, that's what the market wanted to do. Maybe, maybe not. It's certainly, we've set it on that path. Minimum parking requirements add cost, which is downloaded to residents as well. So in some cases, the market will want to provide a certain amount of parking. Other times, again, you're pushing it to provide more, and then that cost is ultimately being downloaded on consumers. Next slide. The flip side of this is what we do want to achieve with zoning in terms of quality of life. Standards tuned to more traditional urban patterns, and we'll give you some examples of that later on, including lot sizes, setbacks, and mixes of uses. So rather than imposing these suburban standards on them, we really study what those traditional urban patterns were, and we set that as the baseline. We encourage infill that matches those patterns by permitting it by right. And we try to transform suburban and auto-oriented areas by gradually applying more urban standards to them. So it's kind of, we're flipping what we talked about before on its head and trying to gradually urbanize some of those more suburban areas where we can. In terms of affordability, a more flexible approach to density and lot size, allowing for gentle intensification neighborhoods and more diversity of housing types, including more affordable options. So we're talking about ADUs, different types of smaller units, multi-unit buildings, townhouses, et cetera, and removal of things like parking requirements to reduce the burden on residents. Next slide. So I'm going to pass this back over to Colin.
Thanks, Rene. So we're just going to talk to you a little bit about some of the places that we worked in. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some work we did in Charlottesville and Durham, and then I'm going to hand it back to Rene. He's going to talk to you about some of our ongoing work in Richmond. So just issues of full disclosure, neither I or Rene personally worked on the Charlottesville project. So if there are any questions associated with this project, we'll be happy to try and answer them. But we don't know the specific details of it. But I wanted to share this project with you because it's a good example of a project where Code Studio got involved in the planning stage. So we were part of a multidisciplinary team. It was led by Roadside and Harwell, who are based there in Alexandria, who were doing the planning work. And they brought Code Studio on to kind of help with the land use planning and ultimately the link from the land use plan to the zoning. And so the interesting thing that happened in Charlottesville is that the conversation about changes of intensity, specifically focused in some of the existing kind of single family neighborhoods, was had at the planning stage, which isn't typical. Usually, planning sets the stage for a more intense conversation during the zoning implementation work. I think Charlottesville decided to tackle these issues head on during the planning process when they put their future land use map together. So, and you'll see there's a very strong correlation ultimately between the land use plan map and the zoning map. And so, in this general residential land use category, one of the very first conversations was allowing up to 3 dwelling units in existing single family lots. And then allowing up to 4 dwelling units if you maintain the existing structure. So there was a focus there from the very beginning to intensify single family neighborhoods. And there was also an incentive built into the system to try and prevent tear down or displacement, to try and keep the existing single family structure in place by giving it kind of a density bonus in itself. And so medium intensity residential at this planning conversation level talked about allowing up to 12 units in a lot, I think is ultimately how it came out. And so with that, we put together the zoning map. And so I tried to line these up, but it doesn't line up perfectly. But you can see there's a pretty strong correlation between the land use categories and the zoning districts that came out of the land use plans. It's almost 1-to-1, which can make your plan challenging because you have to kind of fight some of those harder battles where you're putting the plan together. But ultimately, that will prove out to make implementation through the zoning a little bit easier. It won't be completely easy, but it should make life a little bit easier. And so ultimately, these are the zoning districts, at least at the lower intensity residential scale that Charlottesville came up with. So that there's one district that allows up to 3 units on any existing lot. You can do 4 units if you keep the existing structure. And then if you meet some level of affordability, you are allowed to put 8 units on an existing lot. There was certain neighborhoods in town that didn't want that kind of density or intensity added to their neighborhood. So they were concerned about displacement. So there were certain neighborhoods that didn't get the same kind of intensity when it came to the allowed number of units in RA. So you could only get 1 unit, right? Which is kind of maintaining the kind of single family character of the neighborhood. But if you were looking to put in deed restricted affordable units, you could put up to 6 units on that lot. So then they had, an RB district and an RC district, which just kind of gave you more intense units on existing lots for those particular zoning districts. So, and just touching on some work that we did in Durham. So Durham recently passed their new comprehensive plan. I don't know, it was probably about 3 years ago at this point. We weren't involved with the comprehensive plan. We got brought on after the fact to kind of help implement the plan. And so there was a lot to do, as you can imagine, to rethink a whole new zoning strategy for a new community based on a plan. But one of the key focuses in Durham, again, really focused on affordability and trying to add more affordable housing options to as many places as they could across the city. So one of the things that we focused on was their kind of residential future land use category, and tried to look at ways to kind of increase the intensity across a large number of neighborhoods across the city. And so on the right-hand side and the bottom are kind of the existing zoning districts that the city could use to kind of implement this future land use category. And so we couldn't look at everything, but one of the things that Durham has is it's called its Expanded Housing Choice Program. It was a program that was put into place, I think, around 2019, 2020. And basically what that did would allow folks to kind of subdivide down on an existing lot. I think you could go down to 2,000 square feet, but you had to limit the size of the unit that was built to 1,200 square feet to kind of try and build in some natural affordability. So, one of the first things that we wanted to do was to try to understand that. So we did some kind of high-level modeling just to see what kind of things we could generate using some of the existing regulations. And so we did kind of run some kind of high-level pro formas on these models, just so we could understand the kind of the economic outputs. And so what we found when we looked at kind of the for sale products is that they were working really well. So these units were selling for about $400,000 each, which isn't affordable by any means, but it is kind of, on the market rate side of things, a little bit more achievable. So these units were selling at about 98% of AMI. So they were selling, and they were showing up in neighborhoods where houses were selling around them for $800,000 to $1 million. So this was a model that was working from a kind of a for sale pro forma perspective. So when we tried to run the pro forma on a rental per month perspective, the numbers weren't the same. So things were working out from a for sale perspective, but from a rental perspective, the numbers weren't working, right? So we were coming in with rentals that were significantly over the AMI for the area. So, you know, as much as $3,000 a month, which is a lot of money for folks to afford. So we wanted to understand a little bit about like, well, why was that happening? So this first scenario over here, when we started looking at their existing metrics, they had a density measure in RU5 set at 8 dwelling units per acre, right? And so if you wanted to put 8 dwelling units on a lot, you needed to have, you know, 21,000 square feet in lot area, which just didn't make sense financially. So, you know, we wanted to look at things like, well, what would happen if you removed the maximum density completely, right? What would that look like financially? And then what happens if you double the density, for example? What would that look like from a kind of a pro forma perspective, right? And so what we found was pretty eye-opening and really helped us inform some of the zoning changes that we came up with moving forward. So this is the kind of the no change scenario. We're looking at an average monthly rent of about $3,500. So when we modified the density and reduced the lot size down significantly, you can see that the numbers start to reduce. So just by making that one change, we've reduced the rent down to $2,800 a month. So, and then we've allowed more than 4 units, right? So we wanted to see what would happen if you put 8 units on that same lot, and you'll see that the numbers are coming down. And then we were using 1,000 square feet for the unit size. So what would happen if we dropped the unit size down to 800 square feet? And you'll see that the average monthly rent is coming down to about $2,000 a month. And then Durham doesn't have a parking requirement, but we were assuming just kind of market rate, 1 space per unit. So we just wanted to see what would happen if you dropped the parking ratio down to 0.5 spaces per unit. And you'll see that brought the rent down a little bit, but not much. And so what this helped us do was make sure that we were putting together the right metrics for the new zoning as part of the plan implementation work, based on kind of pro forma economic modeling. And so we didn't have the capacity really to do any kind of economic modeling on some of their multifamily districts, but we did want to help them understand what the impact was with some of their existing requirements associated with their current zoning districts. So we helped them understand that by modeling some of the outcomes of their existing 3 of their existing residential districts: RSM, RUM, and RC. And these are basically the outcomes. So because they use units per acre, and in this case, pretty low units per acre of 8, 12, and 40, they were limiting their ability to generate units as a result. So we just wanted to show them specifically, you know, what could you do if you removed the minimum density requirements, for example. So the same size site, we were generating 4 units. We're suggesting that you could get 32 units and still provide parking. Where you were getting 6 units in RUM, if you remove the minimum density requirements, you could get up to 54 units on that same amount of land, and so forth. So this again helped us fine tune the new zoning standards moving forward. And I'll just pass it over to Rene real quick to talk to you about some of our work in Richmond.
Yeah, so we're currently working on the Richmond comprehensive zoning code. We're about halfway through it, so it's a work in progress. But I think that a bit like Charlottesville, it started from a really good point. They had a plan that was produced in 2020 called Richmond 300. We weren't involved with that plan, but it did do a pretty good job in terms of like talking a lot about built form and setting out an approach to built form that guided a lot of the work that we did. So it effectively, they allowed them to have that conversation as part of the planning process with the general public and got people comfortable with it and got to hear back, feedback in terms of what people wanted for their neighborhoods and for different parts of the city, and bake that into the plan from the start. So when the plan came to achieve implementation through zoning, it set up a really clear course of action for us to take the work they've done and try to translate it into zoning. So it maps out these land use categories that you see on the left-hand side here in this land use map, but those are not really only, they're called land use categories, but they're not only about land use, they're also about form. And for each one of those areas, for example, neighborhood mixed use, you see here, they've got drawings, they have, description in terms of heights, types of building, approach to relationship with the street, relationship with parking, et cetera, for each one of these land uses. So there's a whole body of thought that went into this around built form. Next slide. And the other thing that's interesting about Richmond is that, so Richmond has a lot of traditional neighborhoods built before the Second World War. As I was saying before, it had the problem of zoning being imposed onto these areas that was a mismatch with what was there. And so a lot of these areas were effectively underzoned, or they had suburban style zoning applied to them, and that resulted in huge numbers of nonconformities, which basically meant that, let's say you wanted to replace a building that was there or fill in an empty lot. Even if you wanted to build something that was exactly like all your neighbors, you would have to get a special permission to do that because all those other buildings around you were non-conforming. And so they had this, or they have this kind of Byzantine process of allowing special use permits or SUPs to make exceptions to the zoning. It's kind of a get out of jail free card that you can get if you're approved, but it's a cumbersome process to go through it. And it's basically kind of a blank slate once you get to that point. You can propose whatever and see how it's received. And so in this map here, you can sort of see the concentration of special use permits, particularly in some of the older parts of the city, north of the river, which really align to those traditional neighborhoods. So in order to understand what those real patterns were, given they weren't being reflected in the existing zoning, we had a sub-consultant firm on our team called UTL, an architecture firm out of Boston, that went back and studied some of these neighborhoods and produced what the city called a pattern book. Not necessarily the traditional definition of the term pattern book, but effectively a kind of a study on the metrics that define those traditional neighborhoods. Next slide. And so you got sort of things like this. It's a detailed study that goes all the way from the city level all the way down to the architectural level, selects some of the different neighborhoods around the city and studies, what makes them what they are. What are the kind of the key dimensions that we want to kind of make sure get reflected in zoning and don't get pushed out into nonconformity. Next slide. And so the translation of those land uses that you saw before in the plan into zoning, it's not exactly a one-for-one relationship. As you can see here, there's certainly a bit of overlap, but of those 10 land uses, there's effectively a set of new zoning districts that we proposed that has a relationship with them. So in some of the more basic ones, like industrial or institutional or open space, it's almost a one-for-one. And then for some of the other ones that are mixed use, there's a bit more mixing of these. So we effectively kind of reuse some of the same districts in more than one land use. But there is a kind of a relationship, and the guidance that they had in the plan was a good start for us. Next slide. And so I won't talk through all these, but these are sort of some of the districts that we're producing out of this. Again, they're still in draft format right now, but some of the standards that we're looking at, this is just an example from MX4, which is a mixed use district, 4 stories maximum height. So standards around lot size and building standards. Next slide. So conclusion to this, ultimately we want to try and use plans to set up a vision. Plans play a really important role in getting you to good zoning. And they can take you a lot of that way. So again, setting out land uses, setting out approaches, higher level approaches to built form, they get implemented through zoning. When you do all that heavy lifting from the beginning, it makes the second part of it much easier. Oftentimes we are working in places that have much older plans that are out of date and we're trying to interpret them. It's difficult to do that. And probably the worst thing is where you're trying to actually do planning effectively through zoning, where you have a plan that's effectively completely out of date and you're trying to make decisions around planning from scratch in the zoning process. We like it a lot when we have the foundation of a plan to build on and to effectively implement through zoning. So some of the different things that come out of planning, the subdivision code, the zoning code, all kinds of other types of ordinances and regulations. But we want to see those things created or founded through the planning process. Next slide. So important things to think about here: getting the basics right for regulations, common sense, predictable requirements, and clear, predictable processes. So we spend a lot of our time not only thinking about zones, but also thinking about processes. So making sure that approvals are smooth. There aren't all kinds of different diversions and exceptions that you have to go through. That when you're doing the sort of thing that's actually conceived from the beginning in terms of the intents of the plan and the zoning code, that you can get through the process quickly and transparently. Next slide. And also thinking about, we spent a lot of time talking to different municipal officials from different departments, thinking about how they can work together in the planning process rather than in silos. Next slide. Better communication and strategy. So we really want to try to build up knowledge from the beginning, both in terms of ourselves and staff, but also in terms of the public, getting people really involved, doing educational sessions, getting people really thinking about what zoning is and what it can do, especially because the nature of the zoning that we do, we're trying to kind of get things right the first time through the approach to form, rather than doing a sort of a baseline that has to get continuously modified through variances or zoning amendments. We want to try and get it right the first time. So that involves talking to a lot of people, talking to people who are involved in the development industry, talking to community groups, really baking that sort of knowledge understanding into the zoning from the very first. Focusing on the why. So what do people really want, and why are we making these changes? What's the intent of what we're doing? Next slide. Predictability. I've talked a few times about the path of least resistance. So organizing the code in a way that's easily understood and that allows housing, the right sort of housing, to happen by right with limited discretionary review. That review, that sort of special condition, is really for things that are unintended, not for what you want as a baseline. And right size review time. So again, trying to sort of streamline and speed up those reviews, avoiding too much red tape where it's not needed. Next slide. And then better building and use standards. And we've talked about this a bunch already, but things like removing minimum unit sizes wherever possible, removing density limits, density units per acre and so forth, allowing things like ADUs, allowing both attached and detached units where possible, and trying to avoid certain types of metrics that produce, again, sort of uncertain outcomes, things like FAR. The intent of something like FAR is really to limit bulk on a site, but as we showed in that diagram at the beginning, you can mass FAR in all kinds of different ways, and it actually produces entirely different outcomes. So let's focus on what we actually want at the end of the day in terms of form and use, rather than sort of using these kind of abstract regulations or guidelines. And allowing for more uses in neighborhoods, so allowing small scale commercial. Again, we're usually trying to implement or follow the intensive plans, but we really like the idea of trying to push, again, more flexibility of use in neighborhoods. Small commercial units, let's say up to 2,000 square feet, are a good thing in a lot of neighborhoods. Next slide. At the same time, reducing or removing minimum lot sizes. Again, thinking about other alternatives that we can use that focus more on built form and allow for more flexibility. Allowing for better use of lots, so reducing side and rear parking for house scale buildings, reducing or removing parking minimums, reducing transitional yards between residential and small scale commercial uses, and working with stormwater and fire code officials to develop strategies for small projects. Next slide. And so just, again, better zoning documents, clear, predictable, transparent. We love using graphics. You've seen some of our graphics already in this presentation. I think that's sort of a direction that zoning codes have been going in for quite a while. If you look back at older zoning codes, they're like kind of all text legal documents. We want to produce something that's easily accessible and that any member of the public can pick up and understand and sort of visualize what's intended. So graphics, things like tables, Now there's still a back end that kind of explains all the kind of legal considerations and is just as precise as any other text document. But we want to sort of make it easy for the member of the public to flip to exactly where we are and quickly sort of see the main metrics around what the zoning is going to say about your property. And then when you have to go back and find an explanation, you can flip back to something again that has graphics and is easily understood, and then simple language and clear intent. So for every one of these zoning districts, we always want to include an intent statement that sort of says, what are we trying to get to with the zoning district? Why is it there? What's the goal? And again, language that's easy for people to understand. You don't have to be a lawyer to read the zoning code. Next slide. So where do we go from here? And this is just going to be really quick, and happy to talk about this more afterwards. But so you've decided that you want to have better zoning. What's the next steps? So first of all, again, because we think this sort of has to happen, or ideally should happen all the way back at the planning stage, we think it's important that you get to know your elected officials as a member of the community, that you share your support for change, that maybe you run for office yourself, who knows, but you advocate for that change from the very beginning. You show up to local community meetings and you advocate for incremental improvements to zoning where that's possible. So if we're not considering necessarily an overhaul of the zoning, what are the ways that we can kind of incrementally improve it? And I think there's a lot of opportunity for that. Like I said, there's a whole spectrum of different possibilities. It's not black or white, all or nothing. There's a lot of incremental improvements that can be made. And then when we come to planning, we push for plans that are form focused, set the stage for better comprehensive zoning, that are again are graphic, that talk about form, talk about density and diversity and all those sorts of things. And then finally, when the zoning is being updated itself, you should get involved as a member of an organization, of course, but even just as a member of the public. Roll up your sleeves and get involved. Don't be afraid to push the envelope, show up for community meetings and make your voice heard. I think we really, oftentimes the process is contentious in terms of input we get from the public, but we actually enjoy hearing all this sort of stuff as zoning consultants. And the more information, the better. And so with that, I'm going to wrap it up, and I'm going to hand it back to Cheryl and others to moderate the questions.
Or to Ellen. Yeah, so let's
Ellen.
Ellen, do you want to field this? Let's see. I see John has a question. I'm gonna unmute John. John, you want to? But Ellen's in charge of the Q&A, so I'll just help.
Can you hear me, Ellen and Cheryl?
Yes.
A question really for the two of you. This was an interesting presentation about the concepts, and your Durham and Charlotte are not necessarily a whole lot like our city. And to some extent, I think we have form-based codes in DC. It has, it regulates setbacks, height, et cetera, et cetera. What do you see this, this kind of approach adding to, the discussion that is going to be happening in the next, 2-3 years?
Well, you're asking what we see or what the Code Studio guys see?
Their presentation obviously wasn't based on DC. They don't have your knowledge or Cheryl's knowledge of what's on the ground here. So I was asking the two of you, how does this add to?
Well, one thing I can say is the notion that Rene was talking about in the last slide. As we think about the next comp plan, can we think about it being form focused? Because it seems like what typically happens is we do a new comp plan. It's kind of abstract about, the future land use map and broad policies. But then when it comes time to zone to implement that plan, because there wasn't any discussion about the form that the zoning might take, particularly now where we know we need to increase the overall intensity and density of the city, especially in transit-oriented corridors, so that we can bring down the cost of housing and accommodate new residents. we then the fights all go to the zoning because nobody was, the plan wasn't form focused. It wasn't looking at what the form impact of the increased density or intensity might be. So that was an important part, I think, of bringing the idea of thinking now as we do the comp plan, the new comp plan, can we make that more form focused in the planning stage and not just at the zoning stage?
And so the idea would be to have the stronger language in the comp plan about form.
Stronger forms in the comp plan.
Okay,
Yeah.
Cheryl,
Thank
what
you.
would you say?
Yep.
yeah, I mean, we're starting at the beginning of a new comp plan rewrite, and so we want to provide a lot more guidance for the ultimate rezoning that would follow this. And there is in fact ongoing rezonings as we speak, like Wisconsin Avenue. And so we want to make sure that we're, you know, the city is using some of these approaches, but we think that we need to fully explore what are all these other places doing and how can we apply more of it here. So we just want to learn more about how we can do more to look at opportunities to, you know, as we look to you know, as we guide change in neighborhoods, how can we ensure that we're getting the kind of built form that's going to support that very walkable kind of human scale environment, so that at the ground level you really feel like you're in the right place. I want to move on to Chloe has her hand up, and let me here we go. Go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, I'm Chloe. I am currently with the city of Laurel, and I actually just started my first planning job. So I'm here to take in any information. And I studied in London, so I know a lot about like the UK planning system, but not too much about zoning. But the city of Laurel is actually also in the process of redoing our master plan as well. And this question is kind of similar to the last one, but I wanted to know specifically about the Richmond document, the 300 document, and like what they specifically were saying in that document that allowed you guys to go in and actually like readily, you know, actualize those changes that you were trying to make, and like what specific, because I feel like in the master plan things can get pretty general, like we want more housing or sustainability, but I was wondering like what specific things that you were seeing in that document that allowed you to do your job, I guess, more efficiently.
Maybe I could speak to that, although feel free to jump in as well, Colin. I mean, I think that some of the features that Richmond put into their comprehensive plan were a lot of specifics. I mean, plans are always more general than zoning, so we don't expect the level of specificity that you find in zoning. But it was relatively specific in terms of actually talking about the types of built form that they wanted to see in each one of the land use categories. So you had examples of, you know, you had drawings, you had, again, like I say, metrics around at a high level, you know, expectations around, you know, numbers of units, height, approach to the, you know, relationship with the street, relationship with mobility. In traditional plans, you don't find that. You find much more kind of strategic level thinking, not that level of detail that's actually, you know, mapped out associated with land uses. So I think that was a good start. There's also, you know, specific policy they have for certain key nodes and stuff as well. They have a concept of nodes that gets overlaid on top of their plan. And so some of those they actually had sort of, you know, mapped out kind of conceptual plans for some of those key parts of the city as well. So it really did a lot of front loading in terms of thinking about how things would actually play out on the ground, rather than forcing, you know, the zoning process to deal with that from scratch.
They for the most part, they stayed away from things like density, traditional density metrics, or FAR requirements, like units per acre. So they stayed away from like, this land use category should be this many units per acre. They really focus on height. So they set like maximum story heights for particular land use categories, whether those were, you know, 6 stories, 3 stories, 10 stories, things that were a lot more understandable to folks. I think if they had done the Richmond plan now, I'm going to suggest they might have been a little bit bolder when it came to single family zoning. I think, you know, the whole conversation of eliminating single family is you know, kind of a relatively new concept over the last like 3 or 4 years, and didn't really make its way into Richmond 300. So most of our time in Richmond, in trying to implement Richmond 300, has been having that conversation. We have a zoning advisory committee, so kind of a group of residents that are helping us kind of implement the plan through zoning. Most of our time has been having a conversation with them about how to strategically increase intensity in some of, you know, in a lot of the neighborhoods across the city. One thing that they did do in their plan to kind of allude to this idea that you could have more intensity in neighborhoods was they had major roads, major residential roads, and major mixed
use road. Yeah.
roads. And they did suggest that even if those roads run through neighborhoods, they should get increased intensity. And they suggested something like up to 10 units. But they did leave it like fairly amorphous as to like which major roads would get upzoned. And then when you said 10 units, did you really mean 10 units, or did you mean somewhere in between? You know, so had they been a little bit more specific about what roads they actually intended to upzone, and then what type of intensity they intended to put on those major roads, it would have been a lot more helpful.
Yeah, so that was a, you know, relatively minor part of the plan, but it's become kind of a contentious part of the zoning process because it wasn't defined clearly enough from the beginning. So, so yeah, that's maybe an example where they could have done better. I'll just give you one other example really quickly, and we didn't talk much about this because it's much further afield from you guys, but we both worked on the St. Louis plan recently, and we're now working on their zoning. And one of the things we were trying to achieve with the plan was a more structural approach to land use. So instead of talking about, you know, residential and commercial and et cetera, we talk much more about structural categories. So, you know, nodes and corridors and neighborhoods and other things like that are, you know, potentially all mixed use, you know, to different extents, but it's much more about the types of form that define those areas rather than the use.
Ron Barron, you had a question?
Sorry, yeah. Hello?
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, hi, sorry. Apologize for the sound. I'm actually outside. Um, so, yeah, so I did a question, and I don't know if this is the kind of thing that you guys can answer or not. But one of the things I've always wondered whenever I thought about form-based code is I've always wondered, is it possible for you to speak to, for lack of a better term, the theory of property rights and municipal power that allows us to dictate things outside of the traditional Euclidean zoning model? So, for instance, you know, the traditional Euclidean zoning model, you segregate uses, you segregate, you can dictate the control of lot sizes and heights and whatnot based on the basic policing power that's inherent in municipal government to protect the welfare of citizens. But when you start getting into things such as the design of buildings and some of the deeper features, it starts to get a little bit trickier. So I'm curious, like in your experience, can you speak to that deeper question about what allows us to be able to go there as municipal planners and as regulators? And it's fine if you can't, because it's a deep question.
Yeah, and we're definitely not attorneys, right? And I guess the ability to regulate certain things is different in different states across the country. And so I'll just use the example of St. Louis, for example, who I believe, Rene, help me out, but they amended their charter to make it specifically clear that they could have something that they called form-based zoning. So they specifically felt like they had to amend their charter to add the authority to do that for whatever reason. But I think part of the reason that we try to keep the conversation within the realm of zoning or form-driven zoning or whatever you want to call it is so that we have a tighter link to our kind of, zoning authority to regulate what we regulate, I guess is my kind of high-level answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, sorry, go ahead. Colin.
Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, I mean, it's like we said in the presentation, it's always been sort of a spectrum. So there's, extreme ends of it in terms of like regulating just height or whatever at the very beginning, all the way through to regulating all kinds of other things. And so I don't think form-based codes are necessarily like an entirely different category from other zoning codes. That's why we kind of, again, sort of call it better zoning or whatever. It's on the spectrum of things you could have. I think the other thing to consider is in terms of like the spectrum of detail. On one hand, if you're very, very loose in terms of your approach to form, you may get all kinds of random unintended things, or you may have people building things you don't want. If you get really, really specific on the other hand, you end up producing a lot more variances because people just can't meet all the different specificity that you've imposed on things. So we're trying to find the sweet spot between those two things. And once you get to a certain point, you get into things like, color and materials and things like that. It's probably better to go into some sort of guidelines or into some sort of, if it's a historic district or something like that, or a design district. We try to avoid getting into some of those like very, very specific architectural things in zoning because it just produces there's too many unintended outcomes that are going to happen. There'll be all kinds of sites that can't accommodate it, and it produces variances that bog down staff. So we're trying to find, again, a sort of sweet spot between this range of outcomes.
Okay, Jim Schulman.
Yes, thank you. Good to see you, Ellen and Cheryl. I really appreciated the presentation. It was very clear. I've been interested in form-based zoning since it was proposed in Arlington, gosh, probably 20 years ago, Arlington, Virginia. And it's been implemented in both a commercial form-based code and a residential form-based code along the Columbia Pike corridor. And to my sense, I'm not a planner, but to my sense, it's been implemented very badly. And it's had to have been amended and lots of spot zoning required in order to have it function as far as the development community is concerned. So I don't know if sort of that Frankenstein that is that corridor is something that either of the speakers are familiar with, or if they know. To me, form-based code made a lot of sense. I'm an architect. It makes sense to regulate form in order to get the kinds of qualities of life that we all want. But I'm just looking for any perspectives.
I'm not super familiar with the corridor itself. I am familiar with the code, or the original version of the code that was done by, I think, Jeffrey Farrell and Madden. So, and I know it has been.
Is there an adjustment maybe, like, is it common to adjust the code as it's implemented, or is it something that is?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to, figure out everything on day one, even from a form-based coding perspective. We try to build in as much flexibility as we can into our codes, at least administratively, right? So giving staff some ability to modify things and not have to go through the kind of whole approval process. So I think that is an important part of any code, is to make sure that it is somewhat flexible. But it, the balance there is it also needs to be predictable. And I think it's okay to tweak things, right? Because we're never going to get them right first time around necessarily. We live in a pretty environment that changes a lot quickly, and it's hard to think through everything. So, I mean, even if you look at citywide codes, so Durham's code, for example, that we're currently working on, that was last comprehensively updated, I think, in 2005, 2005, 2003. And we're re-looking at that code again now. And that's, 20 years, a lot can happen in 20 years. I think nobody could have predicted this kind of housing crunch that we're in, right? And so their code didn't accommodate this need for change in approach to regulating housing. Didn't foresee that, which is why they did things like in 2020 and came up with the expanded housing choices program, which was an attempt to unlock some of that unbuilt potential in some of the established neighborhoods across the community. So it is. I mean, I think we're still going to have to get these documents in place, but we're going to have to go back and look at them and expect to update them and amend them over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think in addition to changes associated with policy, let's say affordability and whatever, you probably should just be doing a kind of comprehensive review of your code every 5 years or so, just to make sure that it's basically like a feedback loop where you're looking at how many requests for variances did you get if you speak to members of the community, where the code blocks something from happening that maybe you did want happening, or where did it allow something to happen you didn't want to happen. So you kind of continuously have to kind of look back and tweak those things, plug those gaps or open up the gaps.
It is also easy, I would suggest, to overregulate things. And so it's finding those balance of like, what are the appropriate things to regulate but get decent outcomes. I don't think form-based code is the holy grail, right? I'm going to suggest that you could probably still get bad buildings built under a good form-based code, because you're not going to make everybody happy all the time. We're just like, as we suggested in the presentation, we're really focusing on those like key principles that are kind of the basic parameters of form, right? So pulling buildings up to the street, putting parking behind, making sure you got some activation along the street edge, making sure you got some open space, making sure the streetscape's appropriate, so you have decent width sidewalk and street trees and benches and places for people to sit, and trying really hard to like stay away from like architecture for as much as anything. But sometimes you might just find that you're getting the wrong height in the wrong places, and you might have to adjust the requirements or sometimes you're not getting enough activity in a certain place for some reason, because maybe you're not allowing buildings that are tall enough based on market conditions or something like that. So it's a kind of a dynamic process for sure.
Yeah, I teach the Columbia Pike form-based code example in my land use controls class, and if you look at some of the before and afters, it's been incredibly effective in changing what had been a very auto-oriented corridor to one that had substantially a transformation of car dealerships and a lot of suburban surface parking lots into a mixed use and a very substantially more walkable. I think the other thing that Arlington did, which is a good example for us, and Charlottesville did as well, was looked at comprehensive plan, housing plan, and particularly preservation of affordable housing, and then zoning, and did that sort of all together, partly related to your slide about silos. Trying to undo those silos. So Ron Eichner, you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. This may have a lot of overlap with Ron Barron's question and others, but oftentimes residents, when there's an increase in density, are very concerned about a change in character in their neighborhood. And your sketches for Durham and Charlotte in particular showed cute little buildings that increased density and were very consistent with the cute little buildings that were there before. And I'm wondering what kind of provisions were in the codes to make that happen, to reassure residents that as density was increased, that the character in their neighborhoods would be maintained.
Yeah. Well, I guess, yeah, first you have to define what the character is of a neighborhood, which can be tricky. So simple things like, okay, so most single family districts have a maximum height of 3 stories today, or so you can do things like, well, it's 2.5 stories now, which is basically 2 stories with a story in the roof form. So that in itself is going to mean, because most single family neighborhoods aren't built out to 3 stories, but they do allow 3 stories. And you know, other things like wall plate height, right? So the height of the wall that goes up to the start of the roof, you can regulate that height to kind of stop the overbearing height of a new building on the street and adjacent properties. Building coverage, right? So that kind of sets the percentage of the lot that could be covered by a building, right? So you can play around with that percentage to control the scale of any new structure on a lot. And then, like I said earlier in the slides, we've been playing around with regulating building width, right? So we've for a long time regulated vertical dimensions in terms of building height, but we've started looking at building width, right? So if most structures in a neighborhood are, let's say they're 40 feet wide, you can set a metric that says, you know, new residential structures cannot exceed 40 feet in width, for example, as a way to kind of maintain that scale and character in that neighborhood.
I think
So
another thing is, sorry, go ahead, Colin.
Go ahead. There's just a bunch of tools that we can use in our toolkit to kind of maintain that scale and character in a neighborhood.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, one thing that was introduced in Durham by you guys was working on allowing smaller lot sizes, but also setting a maximum floor area for the units that were built there.
Yeah.
So you can have, you know, more density through kind of greater concentration of houses, but those houses have to be limited in size. So it's about trying to limit their affordability and also limit their bulk. So you're not building monster houses on these small lots.
Laura Croce?
Hello.
Hello.
I work in architecture and urban design here in the DC metro area. My question is about the word contentious that you mentioned. We've had a lot of neighborhoods around our city that have gone through efforts to up the density of the low density zones, restrict or full on ban single family zoning. And right now that we're entering this, housing shortage accompanied by, tough economic times, all you hear about from regulators, from developers, from anybody related to the construction industry is reduce the friction. And that sounds really good when you're thinking about urban centers, right? But when it comes to neighborhoods, how do you advise the planning departments or even politicians to handle this issue that is created, which is neighbors or homeowners are afraid that they're just essentially going to everything's going to get deregulated. And first they supported upping density in their neighborhoods, and now everything is going to become a tall building because there's not going to be a regulatory process anymore. So how do you find a balance of reducing friction, which is completely understandable, but at the same time giving people, especially single family owners, the certainty that they're going to be supporting something that will still be sustainable?
It's kind of the $1 million question. Let me know if you figure it out. But I mean, I think you want to be as clear and transparent as possible with folks and get out and talk to as many different people as possible, and educate folks so that they can understand what's going on. I think also, and they did this in Charlottesville, and we did a little bit in Richmond, but just helping people understand the level of change that might be anticipated in the neighborhood based on any zoning changes. It's surprisingly low, right? So Charlottesville had an economist help people understand, you know, based on existing land prices, what would be the anticipated level of change in a neighborhood with the change in zoning, and it's like incredibly low. I don't know the specific numbers, but I think people have this vision in their minds that when zoning gets changed in a neighborhood, that the majority of the neighborhood or the block or the street is going to suddenly change over time, you know, overnight. There's going to be, you know, all this change in character, and that just isn't true. So if you look at what Durham was doing in its expanding housing choices program, basically the first set of lots that got built on using that program were vacant lots, right? Because those were the easy ones. People aren't necessarily going in and knocking down houses just to add additional units. Like the market economics just doesn't make sense for that to happen for the most part. I don't know if anybody else has any good suggestions.
Well,
I think it's just all about the the tolerance of the community, and it's differs from one place to the other. So I think it's just about having those conversations. And I mean, I think generally speaking, tolerance has changed over time. Like ADUs were like a unheard of thing, not that long ago, and now there's a lot of places that allow them, by right.
And the more types of people you could get involved in the conversation, the better, I would suggest, because typically, you're hearing from upper middle class homeowners that are, more mature in years. And it's harder to hear from younger folks that are, in the rental market. And so trying to have that conversation with as many different people as possible so that elected officials are hearing from both sides of the table and not just hearing from one side of things, I think is really helpful. So, we spend a lot of time trying to reach people that aren't typically reachable in zoning projects. A third of our budgets, I would suggest, goes to public outreach. Even in a place like Richmond, where they've just done their plan, we're still spending an incredible amount of money on outreach, just because the conversation is different when you're talking about planning than when you're talking about zoning. And so you have to get out there and educate folks and help them understand, to the extent that you can, what zoning is and how it affects their life, and get them to come out to meetings to offer up their opinion to things.
Well, I also think that's one of the reasons that we thought it was important to begin to introduce concepts of form-focused zoning, because if people are just looking at proposals for new zoning in text that says, oh, the FAR is this and the lot occupancy is that, and they don't have a vision of what that translates into in terms of form,
Yeah.
the being more explicit and more graphically oriented in terms of form, hopefully allays some of those
Wow.
concerns about what the impact will be on their neighborhood.
Yeah, and a real focus on kind of by right approvals. I think helping people understand the importance of by right approvals, I think is really important, because I would suggest there's probably nothing worse than, you know, having to show up at the city council meeting every Wednesday night because there's a proposed rezoning, or in Richmond's case, there's a proposed, you know, application for a special use permit that could put a crazy amount of intensity on a property that completely doesn't pay attention to the zoning that's in place.
Right. I have a question somewhat related to what Ron Barron was asking earlier. One of the points that you made about form-based codes, form-based zoning, is that unlike Euclidean zoning that only focuses on what's within the parcel boundary, form-based zoning also includes the public realm.
Mm-hmm.
Apropos of your slide with all the silos, if in a city like DC, we have zoning and planning, which does relate only to those parcels, how does one then overcome or even get control of being able to legislate or to regulate what goes on in the public realm in addition to what goes on in the private realm?
Again, let me know when you figure that one out. That's another difficult one. You know, I would suggest in Denver, this is just from my experience in Denver, and this was, you know, 15 years ago at this point, but they, you know, had the same issue, right? This was the city's kind of attempt to kind of add form-based zoning citywide, right? And so they needed, you know, they needed to have the parks department on board. They needed to have, you know, they had parkways that the parks department had purview over, and then they had streets that the streets department had purview over, and then they had, you know, planning, they had building. And so in the end, in Denver, the mayor got involved and suggested that everybody, all the department heads, had to get into a room once a month and meet and talk through issues related to the update of the zoning, and like see if they can basically all get on the same page and hash it out. So it in Denver's case, it took the mayor getting involved, basically. And it worked in Denver's case. How that relates to what's going on in DC, I'm not quite sure.
But I think whenever we do these projects, we try and speak to people from all the different city departments and get them involved in the process as well, you know. And oftentimes they're really thrilled and really interested to sort of see, you know, how they can try and resolve some of the issues that they've been grappling with through zoning. Just to give you like a quick example, in Richmond, you know, they have a lot of formerly industrial areas that are now being converted to mixed use development. Quality of the public realm there is like really, really minimal, like really narrow sidewalks and everything else. There's a strong desire from their transportation department to try and figure out, okay, how can we kind of improve the standards of the public realm through the development process, where there's a comprehensive development, a whole block is getting changed. How can we use zoning to try and actually impose some requirements on improving the public realm? So.
Yeah, well, when we first met the folks in the transportation department in Richmond, they were like, well, here's our top 8 desires, you know, and they were like, you know, make the place more mixed use, make it walkable. You know, we were just like, wow.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yes, great. You know.
So. Yeah, so I mean, it may depend on the culture. You probably have some places where people, you know, don't want to do that. They really want to be siloed off, and it's probably harder to crack there. But at least in some places, they're interested.
Okay. Seems like we don't have any additional questions. Do you have some closing remarks to wrap up?
Rene? Colin? No, don't really have any closing remarks other than just to say, you know, thanks very much for giving us the opportunity to present to you and have a chat, and, you know, really interested to keep talking about your work and aspirations in DC, and share our experiences in the region and elsewhere. So I really enjoyed chatting with you guys.
Yeah, same. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, I mean, we're grateful because we think it's really important leading up to the comp plan to give people the opportunity to hear about what has been done in other cities. So hopefully we pick the best of the best and get a really excellent new plan and new zoning in 2025, 6, whatever.
Yeah.
Cheryl?
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for everyone who stuck to the end. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us, and we look forward to working on this all together. So everyone have a great night.
Thank you, everybody.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks all of you that hung in there.